Hello, book lovers, and today we are going to be starting something new. I am going to be, as voted upon, reading Solid Education. I just figured that this would be a different way to experience one of the stories that doesn't get out there as much, and I had a bunch of readers in my discussion group vote on it, so this is the one we'll start with. If you guys enjoy this, I'll be doing others, but let me know. We'll start right after this.
I don't do it by the book, no, I do my own thing. That's why every single hook got them singing like me. And I ain't in any rush, cause I'm finally getting paid. Don't believe in any luck, I believe I'm self-made, yeah.
So Solid Education was originally done as part of an anthology with a bunch of other authors that I really enjoyed writing with. And I eventually, once the anthology was brought down, I decided to expand it a bit. So this is going to be the expanded edition, which, if you want to check it out for yourself, is actually free, and you can find it in the description. But for now, I'm going to be reading it to you. So here we go. Solid Education, Chapter 1. Strong winds blew snow across the campus, rattling the windows as the storm raged, yet all but one of the seats in the classroom were filled. Professor Derek Paulson smiled at his students as he prepared to begin the day's lessons. He started off by asking random questions from the required reading, pleased by how quickly answers were shouted out. During his brief stint as professor at Kathia University, he'd gained the reputation as a hard, uncompromising teacher, but most of his students were thriving. At the end of the day, he still preferred the company of the animals he worked with in his veterinarian clinic, but he didn't regret accepting the position teaching his future peers. His tough course load had weeded out those who weren't serious about future and animal care, which is why the one empty seat kept distracting him. 3 days a week, he looked over at the seat by the window to see Gage Tackett, one of the few students he hadn't pegged from day one as either a dropout or completely dedicated. Gage turned in papers that were thoughtful, well-researched, and showed promise, but he never voluntarily answered questions in front of the class. He always seemed distracted, yet, when called upon, replied in a way that proved he was listening. Derek knew Gage didn't live on campus, so perhaps the storm had delayed him, but the young man was religiously prompt. Gage dressed like a biker, but he sat up straight in class, and his manner didn't fit his delinquent appearance. He was the ultimate contradiction, and Derek didn't know what to make of him. But he had almost 30 other students who were present and deserved his full attention, so he forced himself to focus on them and forget the empty chair. A soft knock at the door made focus a little more difficult when Derek saw Gage through the small window. He gave the front row students worksheets to hand back before going to the door. He braced himself to address Gage as he would any other student who couldn't show up on time. His policy had been made clear from the start. There was no excuse for tardiness. Gage had already been marked absent. The young man stepped aside as Derek opened the door. Gage's coal black hair was weighed down with melting snow, and there were patches of white on his leather jacket. His clean-shaven cheeks were red with windburn. Gage lifted his broad chin, standing stiff with arms at his side. "I apologize for interrupting, sir, but there were extenuating circumstances, perhaps, but I have no time to hear about them. You're disrupting my lesson, Mr. Tackett." Derek gave Gage a hard look as his lips parted. "I hope to see you Wednesday. On time." There really wasn't much more to say, but Derek wasn't surprised when Gage inched forward, his evergreen eyes darkening with rage. "Listen, you!" Holding up a finger, Derek pulled the classroom door shut. At the beginning of the semester, he dealt with several students who thought they were entitled to special treatment. He never considered Gage to be one of those, but if he was, Derek wouldn't allow him to make a scene. "No, you listen. Missing class will affect your grade, but not as much as being dismissed from this course will. I'd consider carefully before continuing on this path, Mr. Tackett. Perhaps this behavior worked in high school, but it's time to grow up. Derek wasn't even sure how old Gage was, but he could picture him as a star quarterback who'd had the world in the palm of his hand until reality showed him he wasn't a special little snowflake. He hadn't made the cut in his dream job, and this was just his second choice. Not a fair judgment when Derek knew very little about him, but the undertone of aggression in Gage's stance was much like that of the muscleheads Derek had dealt with in school. He was well aware of the fact that Gage could break him in two without much effort. Derek was in pretty good shape. He swam laps almost every morning and watched what he ate, but Gage was huge, no more than an inch taller than Derek's 6 feet, but much wider, easily intimidating if Derek forgot who was in charge. Moving a little closer, Gage met Derek's unblinking stare. From the corner of his eye, Derek caught the man's fists clenching. He braced himself, positive he couldn't move fast enough to protect himself if Gage was going to punch him. And Gage shook his head and took a step back. I thought you were one of the good ones. I apologize again, sir. I'll see you on Wednesday. Seeing Gage turn away, shoulders slumped as he made his way down the empty hall, was much worse than a punch. Derek was tempted to call him back, give him a chance to explain, maybe let him off with a warning. But how could the students respect him if he started slacking on the rules? If he let one rule slide, then the others would be tested as well. He was a good teacher and didn't mind the extra work, but this was the part of the job he hated. He plastered on a smile and returned to the classroom, diving into the lesson and dismissing the urge to let the situation with Gage distract him any longer. The man wasn't one of Derek's wounded dogs at the clinic whom he could get through to with affection and special treats. But later that day, as Derek tended to a young beagle who lost a leg and was bravely learning to function with the impairment, he couldn't help but think how much he preferred working with animals. The rules were simple. He never felt like he was kicking one when they were down, and he still couldn't help feeling like that was exactly what he'd done to the young man who just needed to be heard. Back in the snow, Gage cursed out the professor, not so much for keeping him out of class, but for proving that going to class at all was a waste of precious time. He found the tracks of the emaciated dog he'd spotted in the snow, followed them into the alley where he'd lost sight of the poor thing. He'd grabbed a bag of dog food at the corner store and had a handful in his pocket in case he needed to tempt the mud close enough to get him off the streets. As he trudged through the snow, the cold seeped through his jeans, but he hardly noticed. The dog had probably been sleeping out here, and who knew how much longer the poor pup would survive as the temperature continued to drop. At least the wind had calmed down a bit, making it easier to follow the tracks, though most of them were filled in. He heard laughter in the distance, past where the alley between the old apartments forked. A dog's pain-filled whine quickened his pace. He ran around the corner and saw 3 young teenage boys surrounding the dog, pelting it with snowballs. He wasn't sure why the dog couldn't seem to get away. All he knew was he needed to get the little shits to stop. What the fuck do you think you're doing? Get out of here! Gage lunged at the closest boy, who drove out of reach and scrambled to his feet, taking off without waiting for his friends. The 2 other boys dropped the snowballs and bolted after him. Cowering in the snow, the dog stiffened as Gage approached, tried to stand, and dropped hard as though his legs just couldn't support him any longer. Gage stuffed his hand in his pocket, moving slowly as he offered the food to the dog. The dog sniffed the food, whimpered, and took a little bit, but most of the hard pellets slipped into the snow. It's all right, pal. I've got you. The dog wasn't small. Gage was pretty sure he was a German shepherd, but he was frighteningly light as Gage carefully picked him up. Despite the boys attacking him, the dog didn't growl or struggle as Gage carried him to his car, his cold, white nose pressed against Gage's neck. He let out a soft whine as Gage lowered him onto the back seat and used his jacket as a makeshift blanket. I know. We're going to get you all warmed up, buddy. Maybe get you something to eat? I had some leftovers. Might be easier than all that hard stuff. Getting to his apartment took longer than usual since not all the roads were clear and plows slowed the progress on the bigger streets. He finally pulled into the outdoor parking lot, parked, and got out to lift the shivering dog into his arms. He'd had the heat blasting, so hopefully the shivering was a good sign. He kept his jacket around the dog and brought him inside. He made it to his apartment before a new problem arose. His nosy neighbor had opened her door just as he was unlocking his. He knew from when he'd first moved in that she would call the landlord over anything. He'd gotten a knock on the door within minutes of unpacking for a noise complaint. Middle of the day, and he'd been tuning his guitar without speakers or anything. He never had friends here anymore because he'd gotten warnings just for them talking in the hall. No animals allowed meant he could expect another pleasant visit from the super. His place fucking sucked, but he couldn't afford to find another apartment. He'd find the dog a good home after he made sure the poor thing would be all right. He settled the dog on his worn, brown, second-hand sofa and covered him with a few blankets before going to the kitchen to see what he could feed him. He had some leftover chicken, so he put a few slices on a plate, filled a bowl of water, and brought both to the living room. The dog weakly climbed off the sofa as he came in, laid on his belly and sniffed the chicken Gage set in front of him. He ate slowly, his gaze darting to Gage every time he moved. It took a while, but the dog cleaned the plate. Good boy. Gage sat on the sofa and scratched behind the dog's ears. The dog had thick fur, which had probably helped him survive out there, but it was dirty and matted. Gonna get you to a vet before I worry about cleaning you up, but until then, just looking at you, I've got the perfect name. What do you think of Maddie? Tipping his head back, the dog grunted, then licked Gage's hand. I'll take that as a yes. All right, Maddie. Here's the deal. I can't keep you here, but I'm going to find you a real good family, after we make sure you ain't just lost. He chuckled as Maddie plunked down next to the sofa and closed his eyes. The dog needed to get looked at, but no harm in letting him rest for a bit. Gage took out a few of his course books and decided to make a dent in the assignments. He was comfortable with most of his subjects, but he put off starting the midterm chemistry paper because he was struggling with some of the basics and refused to turn in anything substandard. The professor was a soft-spoken old man who appeared as bored with the work as most of the students, which meant Gage was doing most of his learning on his own and sucking royally at it. He was good at biology, though, so he finished his latest assignment and closed the books a couple hours later with a sense of accomplishment. Quiet while he studied usually made him jumpy, but he hadn't even noticed the silence. He grinned at the dog. Having him here had probably helped. Maddie lifted his head as Gage stood. His wagging tail began thumping against the sofa when Gage knelt beside him. Time to go, Maddie. Maybe the road will be cleared and this won't take too long. Gage sighed as he wrapped Maddie in a thick, gray flannel blanket. The dog was great company, but if he kept Maddie too long, he'd get attached. Getting attached would be bad. And not just because he wasn't allowed to have a pet in the apartment. You remind me of my dog, Gunner. He was meaner than you, though. The stupid punks would have been sorry if they'd messed with him. He laughed as he held Maddie against his chest, and the dog licked his cheek. He didn't like being picked up, but you're a cuddly thing, aren't you? You probably do great with kids. Maddie sneezed and rested his head on Gage's shoulder. His eyes looked sad, almost as though he knew this was going to be goodbye. I can't hardly take care of myself, pal. You need a family with a big house and a huge backyard. Maybe that organic food that will keep you healthy and fatten you up. He had to believe letting Maddie go was the best thing for the dog. His life was empty without Gunner, but he didn't have it in him to love and care for a pet when he'd spent so long with a dog as his partner. A partner he'd lost after serving by his side for 3 years. His steps faltered as he pictured Gunner, wagging his tail and hunting for IEDs like finding Bob's was a game. Gunner would go still and his posture would change when he'd catch the scent of the explosives. With the last one, he hadn't had a chance. Shaking his head, Gage quickly brought Maddie back to the car to take him to the closest vet. On the drive, he caught himself rubbing the tattoo on his wrist. H916. The same tattoo Gunner had inside his ear. His chest ached as the memories haunted him. He knew his best bet would be to drop Maddie off at the vet and forget about him. He'd spent the last 9 months trying to figure out how to rebuild his life. He couldn't afford to get all sentimental and fuck up his progress. A tiny receptionist with big brown eyes and a warm smile looked up as he walked into Kathia Veterinary Clinic. Her smile faltered as she looked at Maddie. "Oh, the poor baby. How long has it been sick?" "Not sure he's sick. I found him." Gage would never let a dog get sick enough to be in this condition. Of course, the girl didn't know that. "Fed him, but I think he needs a vet to look him over, ma'am." She pursed her lips. "Well, I can make you an appointment for later this week, but unless it's an emergency, I'm afraid Dr. Paulson is booked solid." Dr. Paulson. Couldn't be the professor, could it? Gage frowned, adjusting Maddie when he squirmed in his arms. "Listen, he can hardly walk. He was out in the cold for who knows how long, and he's underweight." He tried to stay calm, but he couldn't help the anger that slipped into his tone. He didn't care who the vet was. Maddie needed to be taken care of now. "I'll wait." Blinking at him, the receptionist stood and watched him take a seat with Maddie in his lap. She huffed and spun on her heel, disappearing down the hall and behind one of the wood doors. He rolled his eyes and scratched behind Maddie's ear as he looked around the room. There were 6 chairs on one side, a large window at the front, and the desk, all clean and smelling a bit like a hospital. Smaller than he'd expected, looking at it from the outside. The rest of the clinic must take up most of the space. Only a few minutes passed before the receptionist returned, with Derek Paulson, Gage's animal science professor, striding behind her, then passed as she took her place behind her desk. He stopped in front of Gage, his blue eyes narrowed, and his bearing so like Gage's Sarge he had the urge to stand at attention. But he wasn't going to disturb Maddie unless he was going to be taken care of. For all he knew, they'd have to find another vet. "I shouldn't be surprised. This is twice in one day that you're demanding attention, Mr. Tackett." Dr. Paulson folded his arms over his chest, the same disapproval in his eyes and his tone that had been there in the hall of the university. Only instead of a stuffy suit, the man was wearing a white jacket over a pale blue shirt and a dark blue tie. There was no one else in the waiting area, but the man acted like he was too busy to deal with Gage. "Brittany tells me you refused to take an appointment?" Inhaling slowly, Gage stroked Maddie's head as the dog whimpered and snuggled closer. He didn't want to deal with Paulson either, but he wouldn't let Maddie suffer for his pride. He lowered his gaze and swallowed. "Not trying to be pushy, doctor. He was out in the cold for a long time. You can see his ribs and his spine. I want to make sure there's nothing else wrong with him." Paulson's eyes softened, and he glanced down at Maddie. "See the reason you were late for class?" "Yeah." Gage looked up, not sure what to make of the sudden understanding in Paulson's gaze. The professor hadn't cared to listen to his excuses before. No point in dwelling on that now. He stared up at Paulson, relieved, and the man simply nodded. "Follow me." Paulson turned, leading the way to one of the doors, revealing an exam room larger than the reception area. He patted a metal table in the center of the room and went to pull on some rubber gloves as Gage carefully placed Maddie on the table. Paulson's tone was low, soothing as he petted the dog, and began his cursory exam. "Definitely needs to be fattened up, but I suspect that's not your biggest concern." Gage jutted his chin at the dog. "He can't walk right." "And you have much better vocabulary. Proper sentences, please, Mr. Tackett." A hint of a smile played at Paulson's lips. He gently checked Maddie's paws, his brow furrowing when he reached the right hind leg. "She's got frostbite on all her pads, but there's serious tissue damage on this one. I may have to remove some of it. We'll start her on antibiotics and see if we can get the infection down. I'll run a battery of blood tests and give her some painkillers." He left Gage standing with Maddie and started collecting supplies on a metal rolling tray. "You'll be able to take her home tonight. Make sure she doesn't aggravate the wounds." Gage's cheeks heated at Paulson's amused look, then continued before the professor could comment on his not checking the sex of the dog. "I can't take her to my place. No animals allowed." Lips in a hard line, Paulson put his hand on Maddie's back in a way that Gage could only define as protective. "So you intended to just leave her with whatever vet you found?" "Of course not, but I can't keep her." The patronizing stare was gonna get the asshole punched, but Maddie still needed treatment, which would be difficult for Paulson to administer with 2 black eyes. So Gage forced himself to calm down. I plan to find Maddie a good home. You clearly don't see that as your responsibility any longer. I didn't fucking say that. Gage strode away from the table, returning quickly at Maddie's sharp cry. He put a comforting hand between her shoulders to hold her down as she tried to stand. Shh, baby. It's all right. He was going about this all wrong. He sighed, focusing on Maddie as he spoke to the professor. Can you take her home with you? Just until she's well, and I can get someone to adopt her. Brow furrowed, Paulson shook his head. Between my hours at the clinic and teaching, I don't have time to. I'll watch her when you're busy. This time, Paulson's brow lifted. He let out a soft laugh. Are you inviting yourself to my house, Mr. Tackett? I'm taking responsibility for my dog. She's not your dog, remember? Paulson prepared a syringe. Very well. When we are done here, I will keep her overnight. I will give you directions, and you will arrive at my door no later than 7 a.m. Are we clear? Yes, sir. Fuck, I hate this guy. But Gage reeled in his animosity and spent the next hour comforting Maddie, relaxing even more as she stopped whimpering and jerking every time Paulson came near her. She didn't even budge when Paulson shaved some of the fur on her leg to reveal an infected cut that had been cleaned and bandaged. Brave girl. It took a while, but the hatred faded back to the initial grudging respect Gage had held for the professor. He chanced to smile once Paulson had Maddie loaded in a large travel crate with a few blankets, held out his hand. The professor glanced at his hand, and then jetted his chin towards the front door. I have to lock up. I will see you in the morning. Don't be late. Cheeks heating with embarrassment, Gage nodded. Yes, sir. And thank you. Alone in his car, Gage let out a curse under his breath. He'd been right about Paulson. The man was a complete asshole. That is the end of chapter 1. I hope you enjoyed it so far, and I will be reading chapter 2 probably on Friday. So, if you've been enjoying this so far, make sure to check it out. And tomorrow I'm going to be recording a little bit about me heading off to the opening screening of the Avengers movie. I'm really excited about that. And make sure to like, subscribe, ring that little bell, and I'll see you in the next video.